What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. I appreciate you all joining us today. Very excited for this conversation. Every time that I get to pick this man's brain beside me, it makes me happy because I'm a massive sales nerd. But what we're talking about today is what separates market-leading sales teams from the rest. So what are these teams doing that's allowing them to succeed that we're not seeing? So we're going to be diving into that today. A few housekeeping items as I turn off my notifications here. Housekeeping items. So of course this will be recorded. So we will be sending this out via email as soon as we wrap up. And then number two, this is a Sales Hacker webinar. It's for the community. So please jump in with any relevant questions, and we'll try and field some throughout, and then we'll leave a little bit at the end for probably a Q&A. And now to introduce my awesome guest. For those of you who've been living under a rock, I'm joined by Chris Orlov. Chris, welcome to the community, man.
Happy to be here. It's always long overdue, even though it's only been a few weeks since our last one.
And for some reason, I cannot hear you. So my audio is going. Can you?
I can hear you. It sounds like something just dropped.
All right. So for some reason, I can't hear right now. So I'll do a quick introduction of Chris, and I'm going to try and figure out my audio on my end. So Chris Orlov is the Senior Director of Product Marketing over at Gong.io, the leading conversational intelligence platform. And before joining, you were actually previously the co-founder at Conversature, which is always a mouthful, which was actually a small competitor to Gong, which Gong actually ended up gobbling up. So you guys joined forces in November of 2016, I believe it was. And previous to that, you were on the dark side with all of us, so to speak. You were the regional sales manager at InsideSales.com, and now have really become this thought leader because you guys just have such a treasure trove of data over there in the Gong world, and it's just amazing to hear what you guys keep pumping out. So very excited to speak with you today, and I'm going to give you the floor, Chris, because I'm going to figure out my audio a little bit on my end.
Okay. I just want to make sure the issue is not mine, so I'm going to ask the audience in Sydney if you're able to jump in or just Slack me, just to make sure everybody can hear me speaking before I go on.
Chris, you're good.
Okay. It sounds like I'm good, so we'll go ahead and get into it. I'll speak a little bit slowly to see if we can get Scott to jump back in. But I'll start by just cutting to the chase here. Product differentiation is dead. So this used to be the path to really winning your unfair share of the market, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, having a unique product and relying on that to beat out your competitors. But it's actually dead. So what's changed is now how you sell, what is said during customer-facing conversations is the new differentiator. Okay, that's where the perception of difference is created, and if you can get that part right, that is how you win your unfair share of the market. So how can I say this? Let me just talk about a little bit of a trend that backs up this insight that I'm leading with. The reason product differentiation is dead and the new vehicle for differentiation is customer-facing conversations is because every B2B category is absolutely proliferating with competition. And so what we're looking at here, this is one example of that trend, this explosion of competition. We're looking at the marketing technology landscape on the left, which is 2011, and today, 2019. Mm-hmm.
And
over here at the left.
Jump in there. I am back, and I can actually hear you, Chris. So
great. Glad to have you back.
Good to go. And would you say that we're kind of at this 2011 stage now, at like where we sit in the sales tech landscape?
Yeah, but there's some backstory that gives it a little bit more color, which I'll explain in a second. But in 2011, there were 150 vendors in the marketing technology landscape. And Scott, can you guess how many there are today? Like this chart at the right, how many vendors do you think are on there?
I'm going to say it looks at least 10 to 15x, I would say. So upwards of 1,000.
Yeah. So I've heard two different numbers. I've heard 5,000 and I've heard 7,000. But the point is, every industry is going through this trend. Again, this is an extreme example, and a unique product, a differentiated product, is unlikely to cut through that noise. This is why product differentiation is done. So I would encourage everybody listening to go through a little bit of a mental exercise and just think about your space 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever timeline is most relevant for you, and think about how many competitors there were and also the strength and intensity of those competitors. And if you're like most commercial leaders that I talk to, it probably looks something like this. You've got you in the middle there, and you've got just kind of a handful of competitors, some weak, some strong. But now let's think about what your competitive landscape looks like today. And again, if you're like most people I talk to, it probably looks a little bit closer to this. So likely, and this is what has happened with sales tech, this is happening with every B2B category, your category is exploding with competition. You have a lot more upstarts coming in because venture capital is abundant and costs and barrier entries to starting a business are low. Big companies are encroaching into new markets, and you either have a lot more competitors than you used to have, or the strength and intensity of the competitors that you used to have has increased dramatically, and the competitive environment is much more fierce. You're not dealing with this situation. I envy you, but unfortunately, you're the exception, not the rule.
And they're coming.
Yeah,
they're hot on your heels for sure.
Yeah, competition is proliferating very quickly, especially in today's world. It does consolidate a little bit, but the intensity is still there. And what this ends up happening, or what this ends up doing to your buyers, is it creates what I would call the twin effect. So the twin effect, think of it this way. If you're the parents of two twin children, you can tell the differences between those twin children easily, like the back of your hand. You spend all day with your kids. You probably spend all night if you're anything like me and you're raising a couple of really young kids who cry all night. You take them to the park. You know the differences. But if you go to a stranger on the street, and you say, what are the differences between these two kids? They can't tell the difference because they're not immersed with those two twin children. Well, it's the same thing with two competing products. They're like twin children. People who spend a lot of time with those products, that would be you and your competitors, can tell the differences feature by feature, line item by line item. They know the differences like it's the back of their hand, and they're blown away that nobody else can see the differences. But your buyers are in a different frame of mind. They don't spend all day with your product. They've probably seen a demo or two, and at best an explainer video. They don't spend all day with your competitors' products. And so even though you can see the differences between your competitors' products and yours, and your competitors can see the differences between their product and yours, your buyers, to them, things blur together and they look the same because they can't dive deeply enough to understand the difference. And so everybody's situation looks a little bit different, but here's how this materializes in the sales process. Your buyers, they see a dazzling product demo from you. They see a dazzling product demo from your competitor and maybe two or three competitors. And because they've only seen one, they start to feel a keen desire to sort out what are the differences between these offerings, because on the surface, they look the same. And they create this dreaded comparison spreadsheet between you and all of your competitors, which creates a competitive bake-off. You match your buyer, or you match your competitor on feature A. They one-up you, they match your feature A and one-up you on feature B, you get to their level, this cycle continues until the buyers pretty much conclude that you guys are the same, you're at parity. They do this and they don't, these guys do that and they don't, but more or less these products are at parity with each other. And so the only rational thing for the buyer to do at that point, since they perceive the products are at parity, is they start grinding you both down at price, okay? They end up going with the vendor who erodes the integrity of their pricing model the most, because why wouldn't they? If two products look the same and you haven't been able to differentiate the products, which is very difficult to do, they're gonna grind you down on price.
Yeah, and as sales professionals, this is like the nightmare. This is like, This is what you don't want to be going through. This is when you're banging your head on the table.
Yeah, if you're tracked monthly instead of quarterly, we just finished up October. I'm sure many sales professionals listening to this are kind of feeling the pain a little bit. It was October 31st. A lot of buyers like to wait until the last day of the month or quarter, and they're probably like, yeah, we're going to move forward if you can take 10% more off. And so this is what it sounds like. I showed you what it looked like. This is what it sounds like. And imagine you have, because you probably do, imagine you have a highly differentiated product that you know is differentiated, but your customer can't see it. This is actually a real quote from a customer who's anonymized that I'm not going to say for obvious reasons because they're in a competitive scenario. But before they became a customer of ours, they said, I knew something had to change with our sales conversations. When the customer told me, I've never seen two products look more identical, this decision's going to come down to price. Even though he knew differentiated product, the buyer just didn't see it. So what we're going to do for the rest of this conversation is change that story. We're going to show you how winning sales organizations get their unfair share of the market, not by relying on product uniqueness, which is just the ticket to play the game, but by changing how they sell, by relying on how you sell as your core competitive advantage instead of a list of product features or a differentiation statement. So if I could summarize your competitive advantage in how you sell in just one element, here's what separates winning sales organizations, market-leading sales organizations, like the 800-pound gorillas in the space, the sales organizations within those companies. Here's what separates them. They have consistent sales execution across the board from rep to rep. Their selling motions are similar. Their talk tracks and messaging is similar. Their call structures are similar. It's not erratic. You don't have one rep doing one thing in this corner of the sales floor and one rep doing another thing in that area of the sales floor. Everybody's marching in the same direction, singing the same song in lockstep. So to illustrate the importance of this concept, this consistency concept, I want everybody listening to imagine you're racing an exotic sports car or a dragster in the winding streets of Monaco. You have the fastest, or at least comparably the fastest car in the race. You have high octane fuel. You have an amazing crew, and you've been training for this for years. But while your competitors, your rivals, zip along the racetrack like electric slot cars, you are just sputtering along and everybody's passing you by. And at the end of the race, you find out what cost you the race. And it is each one of your wheels on your car was pointed in just slightly, just a couple degrees in a different direction. But just 1 or 2 degrees was enough to create tremendous friction in a moving forward motion. So the race to market leadership in business is not unlike a race in the Grand Prix. You need an amazing product, that would be your car. You need high octane fuel, that would be funding from supportive investors. You need an amazing team or crew, and you need spades of experience to be able to pull this off. But I am willing to bet your competitors have pretty much those same elements. So if they do have the same elements, who ends up getting the unfair share of the market? Who gets 40, 50, 60% market share when products are the same, everything is similar? And it turns out it is this consistency thing. It is the sales organization that has most consistency from rep to rep. So companies and sales organizations at companies that are not leading their markets, they're also RAMs, second-rate sales organizations. They do not enjoy rep-to-rep consistency. One rep is doing one call structure and going through their demo in one way and executing their discovery call in this way, and everybody's doing kind of their own thing. It's very Wild West. And as a result, they have this bell curve in sales in terms of performance that we're all familiar with. We have 10 or 20% of the sales floor that's really cracked the code. You're doing 150% of quota, 200% of quota, but it's just a small sliver of your sales organization. And their overachievement is canceled out by below quota or below planned performance from everybody else who's chugging along at 80% of quota or 90% of quota. So on the other side of that coin, when you get all of your reps to essentially mimic the same process that your best reps are doing, if you can get everybody to do the same call structures, the same selling motions, talking the same talk tracks, telling the same stories, asking the same discovery questions, you get everybody performing or behaving in a similar manner, you get them performing in a similar manner. And you end up with a bell curve like this. Market-leading companies have more high performers, their middle-of-the-pack performers have higher quota attainment, and they have fewer low performers. So we've talked a lot. Pretty much everything I've said could just be theory or anecdote or opinion up until now. So we're going to do my favorite part of pretty much everything I do, which is backing this up with a little bit of data. But before I explain some of this data, Scott, do you have any reflections on what we covered the last few slides? I know I've been talking a lot here.
No, I'm just, as always, taking notes. And I would flip it back to you. Do you have a hypothesis on what is driving this inconsistency that we see? So not the marketing leaders. So the vast majority of people, what are some things that are driving inconsistency within sales motion?
I think the biggest thing, I think there are two things. I'm going to save the second one for the end of the presentation so that people are listening. Okay. I think the first one is simple though. Just define what good looks like at each stage of your sales process. During your first call, how do you open the call? What discovery sequence do you go through? Do you do a demo on the first call, or do you do full discovery on the first call? Do you do a hybrid of the two? And how do you wrap up next steps? These things need to be defined for reps. The top producers already know this stuff. They know what good is, but they haven't shown everybody what that good looks like. And sales management has not done enough to standardize what good looks like at every call and every interaction throughout the sales process. That's like the one thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, we're not doing a good enough job of democratizing the knowledge that these high performers hold. Like they have it in their brain, but we're not giving it to the rest of the team in an efficient manner.
Yeah. It's either we're not doing a good enough job or we're just not doing it entirely.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Or if we're doing it's based off of, it's not really rooted in reality. It's kind of like theory. Like here's what good looks like at every stage in the sales process. But if that doesn't actually work, like if it hasn't been tested or backed up in some other way, then you're showing people what good looks like at every stage, but it doesn't actually work. So that's now you have consistently poor performers.
Yeah, totally. And building off of that, I think a lot of organizations too will just put in vague best practices. So they know what makes a good discovery call in general, but they don't know what makes a good discovery call for their unique organization. I think a lot of times organizations are too vague in their umbrella best practices.
Yeah, it's the difference between theory and practice. Like, let's take solution selling as one example. Fill in whatever sales methodology you like.
Yeah.
You can read the book Solution Selling, and you can understand the 9-block vision processing model that they recommend, which is their discovery method. And you can know that in theory. But to hear what that actually sounds like in your company in a live customer-facing conversation, world's different.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a great segue from theory into some data. My favorite part always as well.
Yeah. So I'll briefly explain the data. This analysis was a little bit different than ones we've done in the past. I'm sure a lot of people on this are familiar with the research we've done in the past. And up until now, it has largely been, here's what separates a top performing rep from everybody else. Well, what I'm about to show you is a little bit different. It's here's what separates a top performing team or sales organization from, I don't want to say mediocre, but for lack of a better word, mediocre sales organizations. So we analyzed a little over this number is a little outdated. It's pushing 3 million at this point. 3 million sales conversations recorded on web conferencing platforms. And we analyzed them with artificial intelligence among hundreds of companies. And 12 companies in this data set were designated as high-performing, market-leading organizations. So they're like the 800-pound gorillas in their space. They're dominating. Market shares through the roof. Everybody else is getting scraps. And we wanted to understand, what is the difference between a sales team at a market-leading company versus a sales team at a company who's just kind of chugging along, maybe getting a sliver of the market. And the number one insight we found was that market-leading sales organizations have consistency from rep to rep in how they execute their customer-facing conversations. Call structures, messaging, talk tracks, selling motions, all of it is very consistent with little variation. So I'll show you some examples here. I guess this seems like a little bit of a redundant slide, but it moves, so kind of cool GIF. Market-leading companies at these organizations, like I said earlier, they get more of their reps meeting or exceeding full quota because everybody is following the same playbook. So here's the first illustration, and bear with me. I don't feel like this chart is the easiest to interpret, but I'll explain it. This is the rate of asking questions at market-leading sales organizations. And we compared the rate of asking questions between top producers, which is the yellow on the left, and average producers throughout their calls. So this is like the frequency of how many questions they ask throughout the course of their first introductory sales meeting. And you can see that they are pretty much the same. This is a market-leading sales organization, and the difference between a top rep and an average rep in how frequently they're asking questions throughout the duration of a sales call is minimal. Maybe if you really nitpicked at these two charts, you could tell a few differences, but they're not very crisp differences. More or less, these look almost identical. The reps they're exhibiting the same behaviors, but look very closely as I change the slide, and specifically look at the red chart. I'm now going to flip the slide over to second-rate sales organizations, and you're going to see that the difference between a top rep and an average rep is a lot more striking. So here we go. Now you can tell a crisp difference. So we're looking at how top performers and how average performers ask questions at non-market leading companies. And you can see that the top performers look a lot like the last slide. They are evenly balancing their questions throughout the duration of the sales call in a very conversational way. But the average producing reps at these companies are front-loading all of their discovery questions toward the beginning of the call as if they have like a cheat sheet in front of them that they're looking down at, and they're just kind of going through their discovery call questions so that once they're done, they can product dump, they can feature dump, they can do a dog and pony show. And really the point I don't care for you to take away is the fact that they're doing that. The point I really want to hammer in is the fact that there's such a big difference between average reps and top reps at a second-rate sales organization. So call structures were the exact same thing. The AI that analyzed these sales conversations in this data set could identify common call structures. So meeting setup is like the meet and greet part of a meeting, discovery and how much time was spent on discovery throughout the first meeting, how much time was spent on the pitch or the demo, how much time was spent on next steps. And what we found is that at market-leading sales organizations, call structures from rep to rep were almost identical. If they did a hybrid discovery call and demo on the first meeting, almost all reps were following that same process. If they only did discovery on the first meeting and they did a demo on the second meeting, almost all reps were following that process. But in non-market leading sales organizations, it was all over the map. Some reps were doing hybrid discovery and demo. Some reps were unpacking them into different calls. You could go on one side of the sales floor and they're doing a completely different motion than reps on the other side. They were just making it up. So that's like another difference. There was very little differences in call structures in market-leading sales organizations. And then the final supporting piece before we get into kind of a success story that I want to end with is messaging, talk tracks specifically. So this is a market-leading organization, and you can see how long top reps, average reps, and bottom-performing reps are spending on each of these three talk tracks: data security, IT performance, BI framework. And you can see there's a little bit of a difference there, especially the bottom one. Top reps are talking 21% less about this talk track and more about this one and this, that, or the other. But you'll see how small these differences are when I change to the next slide, which illustrates non-market leading companies. And you can see they're talking about totally different talk tracks. They're telling different stories. If you hear two different reps at a company like this, you'd think they're selling different products. It's a product, for me in product marketing, it's my worst nightmare. Every rep is making up their own narrative and they're going to market with that. And the entire organization is just telling an incoherent, inconsistent story that leads to confusion in the market, and nobody ends up knowing what your value proposition is or what you really do. So you can see how big these differences are in these talk tracks in non-market leading organizations. Does this make sense to you, Scott? I know this chart specifically, it feels like it's a little bit tough to interpret, but what's your feedback and reflections here?
No, it makes complete sense to me. So essentially, we've got two different organizations. One is leading the market. They have a talk track that is consistent throughout the organization, whereas non-market leaders, we have people basically writing their own call scripts, or they maybe got lucky once, and when they mentioned hiring process in their pitch, oh ding, that was a hit, right? And so that maybe closed. And so now they always think that they have to bring up hiring process, and it could have been just a lucky strike, right? So they're not doing this based on data or based on what the knowledge of the organization is. It's just what their personal beliefs and experience has been, which, like you said, is very dangerous. And I've seen it before.
And this is scrubbed data. This is from real companies, but the data is scrubbed to keep them anonymous. But it makes total sense. I would imagine that this company is selling like some sort of HR or recruiting software. And you can see the top producers like cracked the code themselves. The war on talent, the war for talent, that talk track apparently is helping them close a lot of deals. But they figured that out probably the hard way, and nobody else has caught on. And the top producers, of course, are paid to close their own deals. They don't have a vested interest in like going to like train the rest of the organization on this. They might mention it here and there, but there's just a lack of consistency in message, in call structure, in selling motion, in how customer-facing conversations are performed.
Yeah.
So I want to, before we get into a few actionable takeaways, I want to illustrate how one company went from one end of the spectrum to another, and they're called Touch Bistro. So here was the problem Touch Bistro ran into. They have around 70 reps. They sell point of sale software for the restaurant business, okay? And they have the same problem we're talking about. They didn't know what separated the best reps, their superstars, from like the average performers who were kind of slogging around at 80 or 90%. They didn't have visibility into what separated those groups. And the protagonist of the story here, Paul Snelson, their vice president of sales, he described the problem the best. You know, I can describe this any better. He said, we had tons of inbound leads from marketing, but our close rates weren't keeping up, and I couldn't answer why. He didn't have visibility into customer-facing conversations. He didn't know why this was happening. Fun side story, Paul used to work at Salesforce.com. So naturally, he turned to his CRM to see if he could solve this problem. See if he could find in like the opportunity notes why some deals were being won and some were being lost, and what the top reps were doing. But all he would find is like 30 characters worth of notes in each opportunity, and it was not enough information to be gleaning. He really needed to get inside the conversations, the demos, the discovery calls, the negotiation calls. He needed to figure out what was going on. Once he did get inside that, once he got visibility into what his reps were saying, he identified the problem, which is exactly what we've been talking about up until now. He said, we had 70 reps handling their sales calls in 70 different ways. There was no consistency. And so what Paul ended up doing is he heard about what other sales leaders were doing in the Toronto area with this technology called conversation intelligence, and he decided to give it a try. And the first thing he did is he profiled his top producers. He analyzed their talk tracks, their call structures, everything. How are they opening their first calls? How are they moving through their presentation? What was their discovery call process? And he did that at every stage of the sales process. He codified it. That was not enough, no. Just identifying what leads to success does not help everybody else get up to that level of standardization. So what he ended up doing after that is once he codified what his best reps were doing, what talk tracks they were hitting on, what their call structure looked like, he turned that into a coaching framework. So at each stage or at each call of their sales process, they had a call scorecard that matched what he learned during the analysis. Setting an upfront contract in the sales meeting on the first call, going through this discovery process, flowing through your presentation in this way and not that way. And he had his managers do call coaching against that framework. So first step was identifying success or what good looks like based on hard data. And then the second step was coaching everybody else against that standard over time. And what he ended up achieving is he increased close rates by 10% on qualified opportunities across 70 reps. And he increased lead to opportunity conversion rates, which is a prospecting metric, a bunch of inbound leads coming in, we got to convert them into opportunities. He pushed up that number by 12%. And when you combine these two numbers across 70 reps, they compound on each other. It was tremendously successful. And here's what Paul had to say about how they're finishing up their 2018. More reps meeting or exceeding quota on the sales team. They don't have that bell curve where the middle of the pack is in the middle, or like you got the big curve in the middle. They've got the whale-shaped one where they have more top producers and their middle of the pack is achieving plan.
Love it.
So we'll head into Q&A in just a second. Really, there are a few takeaways that I would recommend everybody implement, starting in November here. And there are multiple ways to implement each one of these. You don't need technology for all of these ones, but really the first one and the key to making this all work is you have to get insight into what your reps are saying and doing during their customer-facing conversations. If you're flying blind, then everything else doesn't really work. You're making up what good looks like. You're coaching against something that's not based on reality. The second stage is once you get visibility is to define what good looks like at every stage of your sales process. How do you want your reps to open their first meeting? What do you want them to do after that? Do you want them to do discovery and demo on the first call? And if so, what does that discovery process look like? And what should that demo flow look like? You might even, if you want to get some extra credit here, it's worth doing that for different market segments or buyer personas. Flow through the demo in this way when you're discussing or talking to this type of person, and this way when you're talking to this type of person. So you really have to define in detail what good looks like so reps can just execute against a standard, proven standard. And then finally, when you have that piece in place, coach everybody against that standard so you're leveling up that middle of the pack. So those are my three takeaways: get visibility, define what good looks like, and coach against that framework. I think we're ready to open it up to some Q&A here.
I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. That's it's always super, super insightful. And I'm going to steal the first few questions because a few are coming to my mind. So it makes total sense to me. Consistency, obviously, so important across the board. Do you think that consistency can only be created through the right processes that you as an organization instate? Or do you think that certain people are more consistent than others? And if you think so, can you make that part of your hiring process? Like, how do you test that someone's going to be able to follow a process and a structure consistently?
I'm sure there would be people that would disagree with me, but I don't think it's a hiring problem. I think it's a definition problem. If you haven't defined a process for somebody to follow, of course they're not going to define that process. It's kind of like that Alice in Wonderland quote where she's talking to the guy and he's like, "Where do you want to go?" And she goes, "I don't know." And he responds, "Well, it doesn't really matter which," or no, she's like, "How do I get to X from here?" And he says, "Well, where do you want to?" I don't know, I'm totally butchering this, but basically the takeaway from that story is you have to know what you want to get something.
Right.
And it's the same thing with this. If you hire somebody that's inconsistent, that's a bigger problem than they just can't follow a sales process. They're probably just a bad hire entirely, and it's going to become obvious very quickly. But to me, the problem is a lack of definition and a lack of, I don't want to say enforcement because that sounds really heavy, but
yeah,
you get what I'm trying to say. Like, people got to follow it. If you got a process that's proven, you should have people follow that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so my pushback to that a little bit, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, is so when you have this structure and you're enforcing this structure, and you know how important it is, right? We just found out that consistency is the number one thing you can do to make yourself a market leader in your sales team. How do you leave room then for iteration and experimentation? Or is that not for sales professionals of today? That's for a sales ops, that's for product marketing. How would you answer that?
I think that's more strategic than what a rep should be concerned with. Now, for the record, I think there should be some room for flexibility. You know, like, you don't want to script people. You want to be able to let them experiment. But like, for the most part, at a high level, people should be following a process if it is proven, and only be allowed to go outside that for like knocking their numbers out of the park. As far as like experimentation at a higher level, it depends on what part of the go-to-market we're talking about. Like, if it's messaging and you're experimenting with messaging, usually product marketing's want to do that. And fun fact, you should have a process around message testing. You should standardize these sorts of processes. If it has to do with call structure, it's probably sales leadership that wants to own that, or maybe even sales ops or enablement. So if you're talking about like experimenting with new things that, if it's successful, you roll it out to the entire team or organization, that's somebody that is something that somebody in a more strategic role should own. Reps themselves, though, like, even if you define what good looks like, there's going to be a lot of gaps. Like, objections are going to come up that have never been documented, and the rep's going to be like, oh, we never defined what good looks like for this. So let them experiment. Let them start like responding to this new objection we haven't heard before until somebody figures out something that works. And once they do, turn it into a process. This is how we respond to this objection. Onboard new reps against it. Coach and train current veterans against it, and just repeat that process.
Yeah. Great answer. I like it. All right, so I'll stop being selfish, and we'll get to some community questions here. All right, we got Lee Mornan. Lee, thank you so much for the question. Lee wants to know, when we have a very broad product range, how can consistency be implemented?
So I think there are two ways. Number one, if reps sell a single product in that product line, then I think the answer is straightforward and everything that we've talked about applies. The second thing, the second scenario, which is, I would imagine this is what Lee is dealing with, is reps can sell the entire breadth of products. And in that case, what you should do is define how do I say this? You define good, just like we've been talking about, but you do solution mapping. So you're going to need product marketing to really pull this off. What you should start by identifying the predictable problems that your suite of solutions solve. What are all of the business problems that you run into that one or more products can address? You map the sub pain points to each of those problems that one of your products or capabilities can address. And then you map the product within your product line that addresses each of those sub pain points, so that reps know, when I run into this business problem, here is the suite of offerings that I go through, and here's how I present those, and here's the order. This is something that is very difficult to describe over like a webinar. I actually have a spreadsheet example of this. I am more than happy to share that with anybody who's interested in taking a look. Connect with me on LinkedIn and just shoot me a message, and I'll send you like an anonymous version. I'll answer any questions, but that is I know the answer. It's just, the answer is probably too long for the amount of time we have here.
Makes sense. I think you did a good job at diving into it a little bit. So Lee, hit up Chris on LinkedIn, and he'll share some of his charts and flows with you. All right, next one here. Sheffield Dyneck wants to know, how do you suggest meshing consistency between marketing and sales so that go-to-market and sales follow through, essentially one hand washing the other?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, that's what everybody's striving for, right? Like consistency in message, not just in sales, but at every communication touch point. First of all, I think you have to have a messaging owner. in your organization, and that person has to have authority within your organization. It can't be like a low-level product marketing manager or somebody in sales enablement. Ideally, it's an executive, like VP of product marketing or your chief revenue officer. So first is somebody has to own the message. Usually it's going to be product marketing. And then after that, a lot of it is going to come down to training. So on the marketing side, it's a little bit easier because it's like, okay, we've defined the message. We need to communicate that in all of our touch points, update the website to reflect it, make sure our tweets and Facebook updates and campaigns are all saying the same thing. That part's a little bit easier. To get the sales team to repeat that message is harder because they're having real-time conversations where they can't sit in a room and write their messaging and edit it and erase stuff. They have to relay the message in a live conversation. So I think consistent training, consistent coaching, and then getting insight into their conversations to hear, are they actually drinking the Kool-Aid? Are they following the messaging, or do we need to train again? Messaging is like a never-ending training project for the sales team.
I like it, and totally having, I think that authority piece there is key, right? It's having that person that in the whole life cycle, it doesn't matter if you're marketing, doesn't matter if you're sales, if you are speaking a message about our product and they own it through that whole life cycle, I think is important for sure.
Yeah, and one key caveat, like that person doesn't need ultimate authority. They need authority, but they're going to have to get sign off from other stakeholders in the organization, which is okay. But there needs to be somebody driving this at an executive level, ideally.
Totally. And not necessarily, I see it all the time that the VP of sales is directing this, definitely on the latter half, right? And you kind of get this flavor of the month messaging. It's like, oh, this is working this month. Like let's tweak this, and then this is working this month. So let's run with this, and then you get this very confusing message to the market and your prospect.
And it's fine to do that when you're figuring things out, like what's working and what's not working. But eventually you've got to be more strategic than that. Instead of like talking about these little tactical sound bites and talk tracks, like what's the broader picture of the story we want to tell? And how do we get everybody telling that story? That isn't like reliant on product updates, because if you ship a new feature in a month and it makes your current message like totally not work anymore, then you've got to go up a level. You've got to tell a more strategic story and not something so tactical. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, we got another one here. This is actually more of just a comment. We got Todd Campbell. Todd, thanks for joining us today. Todd was the leader of a top-performing organization, and reflecting back on how he exactly did it, and he said, we basically did exactly what you were talking about. And he's now at a new organization and feels that he's gotten away from this a bit. And I just wanted to thank you, Chris, for being a good reminder for him and bringing some clarity back. And he's going to go and build out a process and duplicate it and keep it consistent. So just
happy to help. Yeah, we'll send the slide deck in case your slide deck and recording in case you want to play it back.
Totally. All right, and it looks like the last question. If you have any more questions, feel free to get involved. Chet Conlon is asking. So this is a little bit similar to the one where we asked about a big product suite, but Chet wants to know, how does this apply when you're selling a completely custom product? So maybe, you're at an agency or something, and every single thing that you're selling is kind of, you're bringing in different things.
I think I would have to know more, but I do think it is similar to before. So most likely, if you sell a quote unquote custom solution, there are still going to be a predictable set of scenarios you run into in a selling environment. This customer in this industry is dealing with this problem, this one, this one. So the first thing you should do is profile all of those. You might have like 5 or 8 different selling scenarios, and then you should match the specific parts of your custom solution to each one of those scenarios and standardize against that process. In this selling scenario, here are their pain points. Therefore, this part of our offering applies, this part of our offering applies, and these 3 do not. It's different in this scenario, it's different in this scenario. I think I just explained solution mapping a little bit better there, so hopefully that brought more clarity to the first person that answered or asked.
Yeah, perfect. That was awesome. And all right, so we've got, and Chet says, thank you. That was perfect. So question here, David. Now this is this is a difficult one, and this may be another one we have to defer to answering offline because it's a big one. But regarding what good looks like at every stage, do you have a basic template reviewing each stage and key elements?
Well, I would stick with call scoring. I would turn each call, and maybe if you want extra credit, like each email, if like post-call follow-up's important to your sales process, and turn them into like a score, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how effectively was your upfront contract set? Did you uncover pain? Did you uncover implications of that pain? Did you introduce the solution in a way that resonated with the pain that they expressed? So I would do that. Hopefully that answers. If you're not satisfied with that answer and you feel like I missed the mark, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll see if we can take this conversation offline. But I would say just define what good looks like at each stage and score against that. Do some call coaching.
Awesome. Perfect. And that takes us to the end of the questions. So Chris, thank you again. It's always a pleasure picking your brain and getting some of your insights. So thank you so much. And thank you to the Sales Hacker community. Thanks for taking the time with us today.